Okay, so, you guys have really sent in some fascinating stuff. And we're going to try to take a deep dive into this whole idea of a caste system.
Hmm.
And we're also going to see if there are any interesting connections with this idea of transracialism, which has been kind of popping up more and more these days.
Yes.
Now, we've got a really interesting mix of sources here: YouTube transcripts, some articles, even some forum discussion. So a lot of different viewpoints, which is always good.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that really caught my eye going through all this material was this question about whether, like, historically people thought that, darker skin was just from, like, working out in the sun too much. Like,
Yeah.
that was the explanation. So that's one of the things we'll try to unpack.
Absolutely.
But overall, I think our mission here is to kind of extract the key insights from all of these sources, try to clarify, any ideas that are particularly complex, and basically give you a shortcut to understanding this whole topic. So you don't have to wade through all this yourself.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of material.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we can just dive right in. And I guess one thing that struck me right away is that while, these sources don't explicitly define like a traditional caste system
Right.
in the classic sense, they do talk a lot about like social structures and historical ways in which societies have kind of ranked people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at history, it's pretty clear that people have consistently been grouped and ranked based on various perceived differences. And, skin color has certainly played a role in many cases.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about this example from the sources about African Americans in the U.S., like in the 19th and early 20th centuries, using skin lightening products.
Right.
It's pretty powerful. I mean, it really shows how, like, when you have a society that's divided along racial lines, there can be like this whole internal hierarchy
Mm-hmm.
where like appearance and particularly skin tone becomes this marker of like your place in society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, lighter skin was often associated with, higher social standing, better opportunities. It's a really stark example of how these hierarchies can play out in a very real way.
It's interesting because this idea of a hierarchy based on appearance wasn't just about like these broad racial categories.
Right.
You also had hierarchies within, racial groups themselves.
Right.
So it's like even within, say, the Black community, there were further divisions based on skin tone.
Yeah, and this is where the term colorism comes in, right?
Absolutely.
And that example of the brown paper bag club that Charles Mills talks about. I mean, that's really striking.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, the idea that, social acceptance was literally based on whether your skin tone was lighter than a brown paper bag.
Wow.
It really highlights how deep-seated these ideas of colorism and this internal ranking within a group can be. Yeah. Okay, so that's really interesting. Um, and maybe we can kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about this idea of transracialism.
Sure.
It feels like it's a relatively new term that's been getting a lot of attention lately.
Mm.
And from what I've seen in these sources, it seems like it's actually a pretty recent concept, even in academic circles.
Yeah, you're right. One of the studies you sent actually mentions that the term transracialism first started appearing in scientific literature around 2017.
Really? Wow. Okay, so for those who, may not be totally familiar with it, could you just give us a quick definition of what transracialism is all about?
Sure. Essentially, transracialism describes the phenomenon where someone identifies with an ethnicity or nationality different from the one they were born into.
Right.
So they feel this strong internal sense of belonging to a different, racial or ethnic group.
Okay, so there's like this feeling of not matching your assigned race, I guess you could say.
Yeah, exactly. And the sources you provided, they sometimes compare it to experiences of transgender individuals or people with body integrity dysphoria.
Oh, interesting.
And body integrity dysphoria it's a condition where people feel like their physical body doesn't match their desired physical form. So like there's this strong desire to, say, be an amputee, even though they were born with all their limbs.
Wow. Okay. So, we know that transracialism has been pretty controversial.
Oh, absolutely.
And Rachel Dolezal's name comes up a lot.
Hmm.
Like she's really become kind of the face of this whole debate.
Yeah, in many ways.
But it's interesting because, there are other figures like Ollie London or Treasure who've also, changed their appearance to align with a different racial identity.
Right.
But the reactions have been so different. What do you think accounts for that?
Well, one of the sources presents an interesting argument. It suggests that maybe Dolezal was perceived as more sincere in her identification, and that might have been more threatening to like our traditional ideas of race.
Oh, okay.
So the idea is that if someone genuinely believes they are another race and, they're living their life that way authentically, it forces us to really question what race even is.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Like, if it's just about, liking certain aspects of a culture or like adopting a certain style, maybe it's easier to dismiss.
Hmm.
But when someone is really committed and like living it, it becomes a much bigger challenge.
Exactly. It becomes a much more fundamental question of, what does it mean to be a race?
Right. And speaking of what it means to be a race, the sources also really dive into this whole question of like what race even is scientifically.
Right. And the scientific consensus seems to be that race is more of a social construct rather than a strict biological category.
Right. So it's not like there are these clear-cut genetic differences that determine race.
Exactly. The Human Genome Project, which was this huge undertaking to map the human genome, found that there's actually more genetic variation within like so-called racial groups than between them.
Wow, that's really interesting. So, essentially the idea that like black people or white people are these distinct separate biological categories, it it doesn't really hold up to scientific scrutiny.
Right. And that really complicates the whole idea of changing races.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if race isn't this fixed biological thing, then what does it even mean to change your race?
Right.
And one of the YouTube transcripts pointed out that this whole concept of race, like the way we understand it today, it's actually a fairly recent invention. Like
Mhm.
before the era of like European exploration and colonization and all of that, people were often identified by their like tribal affiliations or their regional origins.
That's a really important point. Before these kind of broad racial categories like, Caucasian or Negroid became widespread, people were often classified in very different ways.
Mm.
And this ties into the discussion in the sources about like the primordialist versus the constructivist views of ethnicity.
Okay, can you unpack this a little bit?
Sure. So primordialists believe that ethnic groups are like real, enduring entities. They've existed throughout history and they're deeply rooted in the past.
Okay.
Whereas constructivists argue that ethnic groups are more like social constructs. So their identities are assigned by societal rules, and those rules can change over time.
Interesting. So like race isn't this inherent unchanging thing, but it's something that's been shaped by social forces.
Exactly. And the current scientific understanding of race seems to align much more closely with the constructivist view.
Okay. So given that, we're seeing increasing acceptance of transgender identity in many places, there's this argument that comes up a lot, this argument from similarity,
Right.
which is basically like if someone can identify as a gender different from their birth sex, why can't they identify as a race different from their birth race?
Yeah, it's a very common argument, and the sources note that it's been used both to support and to challenge both transgender and transracial identities.
Oh, interesting. So how does that work?
Well, for example, people who are skeptical of transracialism might say, look, if race is fluid, then maybe gender isn't so fixed either.
Oh, okay.
So they might use it to question the whole idea of transgender identity.
Right.
On the other hand, people who support transracialism might say, well, if we accept that people can self-identify their gender, why shouldn't the same logic apply to race, especially if both are seen as, social constructs?
Yeah, that makes sense. But the sources also bring up some counter arguments to this idea that like transgenderism and transracialism are perfectly parallel.
Right.
And one that I found really interesting is this idea that racial oppression is like uniquely intergenerational.
Hmm.
And I think it was Deaf and Playton who made this point.
Yeah, that's right. Their argument basically centers on the idea that racial identity is often shaped by shared experiences of oppression that have been passed down over generations.
Right.
And they use the example of Canadian Indian residential schools where Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their families and, their culture was basically stripped away.
Right.
And their point is that just identifying as Indigenous Canadian isn't the same as having actually lived through that specific history of oppression.
Yeah. Okay.
And they make a similar argument about the African American experience.
So it's not just about like liking a culture or adopting certain practices.
No, it's much deeper than that. It's about having lived through, centuries of systemic racism and discrimination.
Right. So like being black in America is not just about like liking soul food and jazz music.
Exactly. It's about a whole set of lived experiences that
Yeah.
are shaped
Yeah.
by racism, by prejudice, by all of those things.
Right. And the sources also touch on this really sensitive issue of white privilege in the context of transracialism.
Hmm.
And the argument is that for a white person to, to choose to identify as black, for example, that could be seen as a form of privilege
Right.
because they can, theoretically step away from that identity whenever they want.
Yeah, whereas someone who's actually born black can't escape the reality of racism. They can't just choose to not be black anymore.
Right. And it's interesting because then there's this counter argument that like by not transitioning, if you genuinely feel like you're a different race, that you're actually like maintaining your white privilege because you're staying within this dominant group. Exactly. So it's a really a complex ethical dilemma.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer.
And finally, the sources point out that there really haven't been what you could call successful transitions in transracialism, at least not in terms of like broad societal acceptance.
Right.
And that's partly because, we can't really change our genetics or our underlying skeletal structure in any significant way.
Mm-hmm.
We can change our appearance to some extent, but we can't fundamentally alter our biology in the same way that, say, someone who's transgender can go through hormone therapy or surgery.
Right. And that's a key difference between, transgenderism and transracialism that's often brought up.
Right. Okay. So let's circle back to that question that you brought up at the beginning.
Sure.
About this idea of darker skin being like solely the result of working in the sun.
Mm-hmm.
So did people actually believe that historically?
Mm.
Well, it's interesting. None of the sources explicitly state that this was like a widespread belief, but they do offer some relevant historical context.
Okay.
So, for example, the fact that colorism has existed historically suggests that people have long been aware of like different shades of skin tone within groups.
Right.
And the fact that they assign social value to those differences suggests that it wasn't just about sun exposure.
Right, because if it was just about, how much time you spent in the sun, then you wouldn't have these hierarchies within racial groups based on skin tone.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. And the sources also talk about, melanin and its role in determining skin color.
Mm-hmm.
And this scientific understanding of why skin tones vary, it kind of contradicts this simpler explanation of just sun exposure.
Right. And the fact that people have historically used, skin lightening products suggests that they understood that skin tone could be changed.
Right.
Even if they didn't necessarily understand the
Yeah.
precise scientific reasons for those variations.
Yeah. Okay, so the sources also give us a little bit of insight into the motivations and the experiences of people who identify as transracial.
Mm-hmm.
Although I think it's important to acknowledge that the perspectives in these sources are kind of limited.
Absolutely. But, based on what we see in the forum discussions and that small pilot study you shared, there seems to be a range of experiences.
Okay.
So, for example, some individuals talk about, feeling a deep and long-standing connection to a particular culture.
Okay.
Like there was one person who said they had always felt drawn to Japanese culture from a very young age.
Hmm.
Others mention seeking social acceptance, especially after experiencing bullying or feeling like an outsider.
Okay.
And they found that changing their appearance actually led to more positive social interactions.
Interesting.
And then there's this recurring theme of feeling like there's a disconnect between their birth-assigned race and their inner sense of self.
Right, like they don't feel like they belong in the racial category they were assigned to.
Exactly. And there's this strong desire to align their internal identity with their outward appearance.
Okay. And, it sounds like a lot of these individuals are kind of struggling with feelings of being different, of not belonging.
Yeah, and they often feel like they have to keep their transracial identity a secret because they're afraid of negative reactions.
Right. Like there's no real clear path or social acceptance for this identity.
Exactly. And the pilot study actually points out some interesting correlations.
Oh, okay.
So while they couldn't establish a direct causal link between like discontent with life and the desire to change race,
Right.
they did find that people who identified with another ethnicity or race were more likely to report, mental health challenges.
Mm-hmm.
But it's unclear which way the causality goes there. Like, does dissatisfaction with your birth race lead to these issues, or do underlying mental health concerns maybe contribute to feeling like you have a transracial identity?
Right. Yeah. It's the classic chicken or the egg problem.
Exactly.
Okay, so finally, the sources kind of touch on some of the broader societal implications of transracialism
Hmm.
and the RCTA materials. They raise some really big questions about, the nature of identity, self-perception, and the role of like societal beauty standards.
Right, and we have to talk about cultural appropriation too,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
because when people adopt elements of another racial group's culture without really understanding or respecting the historical and cultural significance, it can be very problematic.
Yeah, for sure. And there's also this argument that to really move past like these racial hierarchies and these ideas of fundamental differences, maybe we need to rethink the whole idea of fixed racial identities altogether.
Right, and one of the YouTube transcripts suggests that maybe race, like gender, is something that we're taught from a young age.
Okay.
And if that's the case, then maybe there's potential for those constructs to change over time.
Right. Wow. Okay, so to kind of wrap up this deep dive, we've explored the complexities of even defining what race is.
Hmm.
We've talked about this emerging concept of transracialism
Yeah.
and all the debate surrounding it. Is it valid? How does it compare to transgenderism? How is it different?
Right.
And we've also looked at some historical context around skin color
Mhm.
and the ways in which, societies have created hierarchies based on it.
And even though the sources didn't specifically confirm that belief about, dark skin being solely caused by sun exposure, they
Oh,
did highlight that historically there's been a real awareness of skin tone variation and the impact that has on social perceptions.
right. Yeah. This has been a really fascinating look into a topic that's clearly still evolving. There are no easy answers here.
Definitely not.
So to leave you with a final thought, given everything we've talked about how race is socially constructed and this growing awareness of gender fluidity, I guess the question is what are the possibilities and the challenges that we're going to face in the future in terms of how we understand human identity? What does it even mean to authentically identify with a group when the boundaries of those groups are constantly being questioned and redefined?
That's a really huge question, and I think it's one that we're going to be grappling with for a long time to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing these incredible sources with us and for joining us on this deep dive. I hope you'll continue to explore these really important and fascinating topics.
Yeah, me too.
All right, thanks again.